There's a really important story I want to go into today about the Chinese Communist Party launching a cognitive war against the United States, and the Pentagon's now warning about it. Let's dive right into this. Now look, a new Pentagon report says the Chinese regime is planning to launch a cognitive war against the United States. And the Department of Defense released its 2024 report to Congress on the military and security developments of the CCP, and it notes for the first time that the CCP is planning to launch a sophisticated information warfare operation against the United States. And this operation will allegedly include the use of deepfake AI content and other forms of psychological warfare. And let me show you this. This is China expert Bill Gertz explaining the significance of this in the Washington Times. He said this. He said the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the military of the CCP, has added hundreds of new missiles and 100 more nuclear warheads as part of a military buildup designed for a war with the United States, according to the Pentagon report made public on Wednesday. Now, this is important because this is the largest military buildup we've seen with the CCP going back in history, about as far as we can remember. This is a significant military buildup, suggesting that they want a war. Now, Gertz notes for the first time, the survey of Chinese military power reveals extensive PLA preparations for sophisticated information warfare operations against the United States, including the use of deepfake online posts and cyber-enabled psychological warfare. And as the Pentagon analyst said, the goal is to influence U.S. military leaders' decision-making, demoralize troops, and sow divisions in American society. Meaning, this is targeted at the U.S. military, but also targeted at elements within American society itself, meaning a domestic attack. Now, they note the PLA calls its information warfare activities, quote, cognitive domain operations, which we'll get into in a bit. And notes the report describes an asymmetric capability to deter U.S. or third-party entry into a future conflict, or as an offensive capability to shape perceptions or polarize a society. It says the operations target the U.S. government and military, media organizations, businesses, academic and cultural institutions, and policy communities, targeting both, again, the U.S. military, the U.S. government, but also civil society, news outlets, cultural organizations, businesses, academics, and so on. This is both political and military, but also extending even into civil relations and so on. Now, notice the PLA has created a military subunit called the Information Support Force, which conducts, quote, 3 warfares. That's public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. You might know we've talked about this recently. It says further in, the report said the PLA, again the People's Liberation Army, needs cognitive warfare tools to counter the American use of digital narratives to undermine the Chinese communist system. And the Chinese military views cognitive warfare as the next evolution in information warfare using modern internet technology and communication platforms, seeking to change enemy behavior and decision-making through artificial intelligence, big data, brain science, and neuroscience. It says that plans call for using deep fakes, such as synthetic media that imitates the voices of foreign senior political or military leaders to mislead adversaries and influence decisions. Things that may not be so effective within the United States, but in other countries could be extremely effective in terms of the way they want to use it. Now, look, this is actually really big. This would likely involve the Chinese Communist Party manipulating open platforms, social media, even news outlets and so on, outside of China. They could be feeding fake stories to news outlets, which we've been talking about on the show is something that they've been saying they're going to do. It could be them creating fake online personas. It could be them feeding news and information to, for example, YouTubers and other online influencers. Again, this is information that we've also gotten in terms of leaked documents saying the CCP is planning to do. Interestingly, it could also include the use of technologies like deep fakes, suggesting they may create fake online influencers, fake personas. Chinese media, notably in China, they've begun doing this even with newscasters. Some of their news broadcasters are just AI now. They're deep fakes. Because again, the CCP wanted to control everything. It's dangerous if you create a newscaster and they have the ability of free thinking. Now, here's a bit more on the CCP's new military plan from the official Pentagon report. This is the U.S. Department of Defense annual report to Congress on military and security developments of the Chinese Communist Party. It says here under the section on influence operations, it says the PLA, again the People's Liberation Army, the official military branch, it's like the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. The PLA views controlling the information spectrum in the modern battle space as a critical enabler of information dominance early in a conflict. It says beginning in the early 2000s as part of the PRC's, People Republic of China's, overall influence operations, the PLA began developing the three warfares concept, which calls for the coordinated use of public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. It's also been translated before, as we've noted on the show, as media warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, which we'll get into in a bit. And notice the PLA likely seeks to combine digital influence activities with the three warfares concept to demoralize adversaries and influence domestic and foreign audiences, creating an environment advantageous to the PRC, again, the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China. Now it says, since at least the mid-2010s, the PLA has been incorporating the concept of cognitive warfare, or CDO, into PLA's frameworks for conducting influence operations, trying to influence foreign leaders, news outlets, academics, anybody of influence in a society. They talk about this as leadership capture. They go to countries and they try to capture the minds and the mouths of every single person of influence to make them serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. That's how it works. Meaning your college professors, your big tech company, they will actually be acting in the interests of the Chinese Communist Party while masquerading as being a U.S. business or a U.S.-based professor or whatever else, or even news outlets for that matter. It says, while the concept of cognitive warfare appears to be a PLA-specific, overall PRC influence operations reflect a whole-of-government approach to shaping the information environment. And from the PRC's perspective, all nations, especially the United States, that use digital narratives to undermine the CCP's authoritarian system and employ offensive influence operations. The CCP regards news outlets, critics of the CCP, as being like basically agents. They regard anybody who attacks the Chinese Communist Party, who speaks badly against the Chinese Communist Party, as being like a soldier on a battlefield. And the CCP wants to aim and attack these individuals, like myself, for example, because, again, it views us as being soldiers on the information battlefield. Anybody who exposes the CCP, anybody who talks about their human rights abuses, anybody who talks about what they're doing to subvert foreign societies, on the information warfare landscape, this is the battlefield as far as they're concerned. Now, the report says as well that hence the PRC considers its influence operations that counter this perceived subversion as defensive to protect the party, meaning the CCP, and the military. And notes another primary goal of the PRC's influence operations is to maintain domestic stability and protect CCP rule. And when you're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, domestic stability means preventing people from revolting in China against the Chinese Communist Party. And when they say protecting CCP rule, they mean that making sure the people of China don't try to overthrow the CCP. When it comes to that, they view public support and public information as the main threat against the CCP itself. And so anybody who, again, spreads things that would expose the Chinese Communist Party, criticize the Chinese Communist Party, detail what it's doing, they are regarded as enemies and enemy combatants on the information warfare battlefield. That's what they're saying. Now, the Pentagon report adds that domestically, the CCP uses influence activities to protect its image with the public and garner popular support for the military. Internationally, meaning here in the United States, it says that Beijing aims to create an information environment favorable to the PRC and its strategic foreign policy objectives. Meaning, again, it needs to go after every person who criticizes the CCP. It says PRC influence operations target media organizations, meaning news outlets, businesses, academic and cultural institutions, and policy communities of the United States and other countries, and international organizations to achieve outcomes favorable to its strategic and military objectives. Meaning that while this is a military branch of the CCP carrying out military operations, their targets are civil society organizations. They are targeting with their military American news outlets, whether it means feeding them fake information or attacking them. It means going after academics, whether it means exposing them and trying to tear them down, or maybe giving them money, bribing them, coercing them, and getting them in the CCP's pockets. And even, again, cultural organizations, whether, again, supporting the ones that are favorable to the CCP or trying to tear down the ones that are critical of the CCP. Now, it's interesting. I actually exposed a lot of this in a recent feature as well, including about how the CCP's Three Warfares program works and how it ties in with the regime spy operations. If you haven't seen that feature yet, I recommend watching it. At the Epoch Times, basically, we received documents and we had whistleblowers step forward, and they revealed the Chinese Communist Party was planning to launch operations against Shenyun Performing Arts, the Epoch Times, and NTD Television. The orders for this came from Xi Jinping himself, the head of the Chinese Communist Party. And what we were told by these whistleblowers was basically Xi Jinping believes this has to be done because we expose the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping is afraid that when President-elect Donald Trump comes into office, that Trump may take actions that could destroy the communist regime. And because of this, the Chinese Communist Party wants to silence or destroy anybody of influence, including right here in the United States, who exposes the Chinese communist regime and its human rights abuses. And so Xi Jinping himself has given orders to launch a whole-of-government operation for the CCP to attack Shenyun, the Epoch Times, and NTD outside of China. And again, this lines up with what the Pentagon is saying as well. Now, the CCP's plan is basically this. Its agents are framing false narratives. They plan to use these to feed to U.S.-based news outlets and online influencers. Again, the CCP crafts the information. Their military is involved with it. Spy organizations are involved in it. They go to news outlets in the United States and they feed them the information that they've stolen or crafted. These news outlets and online influencers then spread it. And if these organizations run the CCP's false narratives, they then plan to have other agents use these reports to file legal attacks against us. And as I noted in the investigative feature, this ties in with a long-standing CCP military program called the Three Warfares, the one named in this new Pentagon report. Again, it's also translated as psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. And basically what that means is this. Psychological warfare is how you frame narratives. It's how you pitch something. It's the narrative. Psychological warfare is the interpretation of information. Media warfare is to control the outlets of information. And legal warfare, or lawfare as some people call it, is to use these narratives to manufacture lawsuits and other legal attacks, again, manipulating international legal systems. Now, so far, we're watching for this. We have, in fact, seen ongoing attacks against Shenyun coming from the New York Times, which appears to be in line with the CCP campaign, at least based on the nature of it and what they're doing. It turned out one of the individuals named in the leaked documents we received from the Chinese Communist Party, again, by whistleblowers, actually took credit for introducing the New York Times to its sources that they used to attack Shenyun. And the New York Times also failed to disclose that some of its sources used to have ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Meaning, again, they didn't disclose that. And that does raise concerns over, well, are the individuals they're interviewing also getting information from within China? We don't know at this point. But this should also come as no surprise. The New York Times has a long history of backing totalitarian regimes, from the Chinese Communist Party right now as we speak, to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In fact, they were some of the biggest supporters of Joseph Stalin and so on, to the Nazis ahead of World War II. And just like the New York Times right now is helping the Chinese Communist Party cover up and even spread its persecution against religions like Falun Gong, the New York Times did the same exact thing, helping the Nazis cover up the Holocaust. This has been brought up quite a bit recently. In fact, over the New York Times seeming to take a stance against Israel after the October 7 attacks. Mark Levin, host of Fox News' Life, Liberty, and Levain, detailed some of this in November last year. Watch this.
When there's an obvious right versus wrong, good versus evil, people trying to exterminate other people, at a time like this, you can really see who the culprits are, who the reprobates are. When it comes to the fundamentals of life versus death, the extermination of human beings by a regime, the New York Times sided with, quote unquote, the regime in the manner in which it reported or didn't report information. And it's doing exactly the same thing today, despite its phony apology in 2001. The New York Times is loaded with Israel-hating anti-Semites, just as it's loaded with American-hating reporters, opinion writers, and so forth. You have to ask yourself, if you're a reporter for the New York Times, you have any connection to the New York Times, aren't you ashamed of yourself? With the blood that this newspaper has on its hands, and I can't do it right now, but also 1932, Walter Duranty was their correspondent in Moscow. He was Stalin's mouthpiece for 12 years. They knew it. And in 1932, Stalin slaughtered millions of Ukrainians. Something about the Russians slaughtering Ukrainians, you know. But they did it then, too. And the New York Times kept them.
Now, for the New York Times, this isn't anything new. But I'd say this is not just some surface-level agreement or some regular type of policy debate or something like that. I would actually say the New York Times, they supported the Nazis. They supported Stalin. They support the CCP today in many regards, including in its human rights abuses that these regimes have carried out, because the New York Times seems to support these regimes on a fundamental and ideological level, namely communism. When it comes down to it, the New York Times has openly supported communism, the foundation of all these totalitarian regimes. And yes, even Adolf Hitler was a socialist. It was the National Socialist Party. Look, back in 2017, after the Epoch Times started publishing a series to expose the bloody history of communism, we again ran a big series exposing everything the communist parties have done in different parts of the world, the genocides, the human rights abuses, the religious persecutions, the policies and political programs they had that led to things like mass famine. We exposed this. The New York Times, right when we started doing that, came out and did the exact opposite. Instead of exposing the genocides, the abuses, and the horrors that the world witnessed under communism, a belief that has killed between 100 million and 150 million people, depending which estimates you go by, the New York Times, they ran what it called the Red Century series, and the New York Times defended and promoted communism. When we were running stories exposing the gulags, the famines, the religious abuses, in our series, The Dead End of Communism, we called it, when we exposed how communism carried out its atrocities and what it still aims to do today, the New York Times did the opposite. They published a series with headlines that could have been pulled directly out of CCP propaganda slogan classes. Let me show you one of them. This is New York Times, folks. Quote, "How Mao," meaning Mao Zedong, "molded communism to create a new China." And any person from China would know that slogan, because in China, under the Chinese Communist Party, kids in school have to attend what they call slogan classes and they have to repeat CCP propaganda, one of the slogans they have is there would be no new China without the Chinese Communist Party. The New York Times basically said that in this piece, arguing, again, fully in line with CCP propaganda. The New York Times defended brutal movements under communist regimes in this series. It praised the violent revolutions. It even talked about how sad it was that some of them didn't work. This is New York Times. It even promoted the dictators and the tyrants under these regimes. And the New York Times has continued doing this. It's in the official series like this, right? It's not just this, it's other things. It's throughout their articles. It shows up in their op-eds that it allows on its opinion pages. Things like this, for example, from 2018. This is New York Times. Happy birthday, Karl Marx. You were right. That's New York Times. And that opinion piece says, quote, we are destined to keep citing him, meaning Karl Marx, and testing his ideas until the kind of society that he struggled to bring about and that increasing numbers of us now desire is finally realized. The New York Times wrote that, or again allowed it to be printed. What kind of newspaper publishes these things? Karl Marx will be remembered as having spurred the most murderous regimes the world has ever known. And they praise him. Maybe this is why they hate us so much. Or maybe it's because the New York Times is still assisting communist regimes in this way, including the Chinese Communist Party right now as we speak, and including in helping the CCP cover up its persecution and live organ harvesting of people who practice the religion of Falun Gong. Epoch Times said this in August. It said at critical moments over the past 25 years, the New York Times has aided the interests of a power faction within the Chinese Communist Party responsible for atrocities against practitioners of the spiritual discipline Falun Gong. On top of implicating itself ethically, the paper has also, as a result, distorted its China coverage and misled its readers, as revealed by an analysis of the New York Times' China coverage, as well as interviews with half a dozen experts on Chinese Communist Party politics and geopolitics. It says due to the paper's disproportionate influence on policy, its skewed coverage has likely led to a loss of life and treasure that is difficult to quantify, some experts said. It says the New York Times has for decades positioned itself as a global newspaper, insisting on the necessity of access to China, according to former staffers. That meant convincing the Chinese Communist Party that the paper's presence would benefit it. Now, even more than this, when they had the China Tribunal in the UK, where the live organ harvesting issue was put on trial, they had experts, witnesses come in. Again, in the United Kingdom, they had a trial on the Chinese Communist Party for carrying out live organ harvesting. And not only did they determine that the CCP is murdering people for their organs, the majority of them being practitioners of Falun Dafa, again, a Chinese religion based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Not only is the CCP murdering them for their organs, but it came up in the China Tribunal that one witness came forward who was a former New York Times reporter saying that the New York Times refused to publish stories on it when this individual had information showing that it was real. They refused to expose this. And I'd say, why is that? Now, like in my personal opinion, I'd say this is probably also the reason the New York Times is attacking Shen Yun Performing Arts right now. It's because Shen Yun shows the culture of traditional China that the Chinese Communist Party has destroyed, or tried to at least. And they also expose the CCP's persecution of religion, religious persecutions that the New York Times has actively helped the CCP cover up. And the Chinese Communist Party also regards Shen Yun, and Epoch Times in particular, as some of its main enemies. Maybe this is why they're attacking us. Now, if you're wondering why the New York Times does this, why they deceive, why they omit key facts, why they crush stories and don't allow them to be shown to the public when they show these types of abuses in China, and background in their stories to paint things in the same light as brutal communist regimes like the CCP, well, it's probably because they share the same bias. They seem to support, in fact, they have series on it, the same communist ideologies, even openly. They ran a whole series, again, promoting it. And it's not just something recent. This is a historical issue for the New York Times, and a problem that goes into its many other agendas, from them covering up the Holocaust, to the New York Times lying about the Soviet Union to paint it in a positive light, something that again damaged the Cold War of the United States when we were trying to fight the communist uprisings all around the world, to even the New York Times promoting all the various forms of cultural Marxism that we see today. In fact, if you look at cultural Marxism and all the degenerate things it's trying to do, you'll find the New York Times trying to advance nearly all of them. They are trying to push them on our society. And why is that? And this includes even to the New York Times today attacking anybody who tries speaking out about these trends, the hit pieces, the articles they publish going after the influencers who try to expose these things. Why did they do that? To even the New York Times right now seeming to side with terrorist groups and their attacks on Israel, something Mark Levin and others have been very critical of. To the New York Times right now trying to run its nonstop hit pieces fully in line with a CCP cognitive warfare program, at the very least going after the same organizations the CCP is targeting, acting fully in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party by doing so, whether knowingly or not. And again, all of this right now is being fully exposed. We've gotten leaked documents. We have whistleblowers stepping forward detailing it. And for the New York Times, I would say this is a pattern. This is something they've been doing for decades. This is something they've been doing going back again to World War II at least. This seems to be something in the lifeblood of the news outlet, this support for communist and totalitarian regimes. And for the CCP also, the operations like this cognitive warfare plan they're rolling out, well, the communist regime has now given orders to carry out a cognitive war against the United States, including against civil organizations in this country, media organizations, influencers, anybody who is critical of the CCP. The agenda is already being exposed. Again, folks, we have gotten personally leaked documents on these plans. We've already had multiple whistleblowers step forward, and governments are already acting to even arrest some of the agents who are being exposed as being involved. Through this, the Chinese Communist Party's agents and its controlled assets are now showing themselves. And as this happens, its networks for subversion and influence operations, it is now being exposed. And again, we'll continue exposing it as it goes forward. All right, folks, that said, we're going to jump into a short break now. Come back to the Q&A. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the chat. We'll be back in less than 60 seconds.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. All right, folks, that's it. Let's jump into some questions. And also on that point, if you want to talk about any other topics, let us know in the comments as well. There's a lot going on right now. We have no shortage of big stories happening. Another topic we can go into maybe in a future episode, but if you have questions on it, there's a big discussion around visas right now. I know Elon Musk has been kind of sparring with even some Trump supporters on this. Trump has come out in support of them. We can talk about any of that. But let's start with the first one here. Martin McKenzie, you're saying, this has also been called full spectrum dominance. If you can control hearts and minds, you don't need to fire a shot. Yeah, that's fully accurate. Actually, the United States, I've mentioned this before, the United States really came to understand this in Vietnam. and later in the war in Iraq, right, when we had the coin strategy, counterinsurgency. If you know, basically the Vietnam War, the way the United States was fighting it is basically we were trying to determine who was winning the Vietnam War by counting bodies, right? Some of you may remember this in history. We were counting bodies, and we would determine who was the winner or loser in a battle based on the number of troops killed on either side of the battlefield. And the Vietnamese and the Chinese Communist Party, who again, you know, they were supplying a lot of the stuff to the Viet Cong during that time, they were viewing it differently. The Viet Cong said that they were fighting two wars. They said there was the war of bullets and there was the war of words. And the war of words was the kind of stuff the New York Times was backing, right? The war of words was the kind of stuff they were backing with like student protests and the different movements within the United States. It was the war of words when the Soviet Union was inviting, you know, journalists like Time and Look, you know, Life and Look magazine to go to, you know, the Soviet Union, and they would show them these Potemkin village type things, like fake factories and fake productions and so on, and make it look like life in communism was fantastic, right? They painted false images like this. They showed these journalists totally fake views of what life was like in these countries. And these journalists would then go back to the United States and they'd write these glowing articles on how good communism was. The same thing they're doing today, by the way, with China, I should note. And what happened with that? Well, you had students and academics in the United States who took that and said, oh, America's the bad guy fighting, you know, against the people's utopia or something like that, which led to these mass student movements and the anti-war movements and everything else because they believed America was the bad guy fighting against these totalitarian regimes. Look, I've heard some horror stories about what the communists were doing in these countries. Again, you know, my father-in-law escaped the Khmer Rouge, you know, in Cambodia. I talked to one guy, he was a colonel in the Marines in Vietnam. He said that the Viet Cong, they would go into villages, right? And they had these communist leaders who'd go in. I mean, I'll tell you one of the, it's a sad story, so bear with me. But just emphasizing this. The communists would go into villages and basically they wanted to kill the leaders. So they would kill the village chiefs, they would kill the people of influence because the Communist Party wanted to replace them. One of the stories I was told by, he's again, Vietnam veteran, former colonel, retired colonel. He said he went into one of these villages and there was this little girl who, you know, was an orphan. She'd walk around and she wouldn't talk. She was traumatized. She had a can, and the can was like her teddy bear, this like, you know, tin can. It was her teddy bear. Sorry. So what they did, I'm sorry, folks. What the Communist Party had done is they went into this village. They took this little girl's parents, right? Her parents were the village leaders. They tied them down with their arms and legs spread, like on the ground, right? And the communist leaders, they got the whole village together and they gave lectures to the communist, you know, on the Communist Party to the village. And they hacked the parents down their limbs, like slicing down the limbs, while lecturing the village about communism and about the oppressor class, because the you know, these were it was the village chief and his wife, right? And this little girl witnessed that. That was her parents. You know what I mean? You know, that was the kind of stuff we were fighting against, and I mean, and that's the kind of stuff you still have happening today under these regimes. And it's really, in my opinion, it's very sick that you have these organizations ignoring these abuses in order to promote the ideologies of these systems. You know, that's what you have these organizations doing. And that's where it gets real twisted. Imagine if you had an organization talking about the Nazis like this, and they were just promoting it, but they were ignoring all the abuses, all the human rights abuses. If even they excused it and said, you got to break a few eggs to reach the utopia. That's the kind of stuff these organizations are doing. That's the kind of stuff they were lying to people about in order to frame these narratives. And if you go back to the time of the Soviet Union, if you look at the gulags, if you look at the famines, if you look at the abuses that took place under the Soviets, organizations like the New York Times and others that were defending these communist systems, they often did it by turning a blind eye to the atrocities, by saying, oh, it was just a famine, the Communist Party had nothing to do with it, or they were saying things like maybe ignoring it and just suggesting that if you want to achieve the utopia, then this is just necessary abuses. That's what these organizations are doing. And the real sick thing with these organizations is they're still doing it. This is what the Chinese Communist Party is doing right now in China, and organizations like the New York Times are supporting it. At the very least, by not reporting on the live organ harvesting. At the very least, by covering up things and like refusing to publish articles about this. And I'd say even more so going the opposite way, where they're even assisting the Chinese Communist Party, at least in spirit, by helping them criticize and attack any critics of the regime. That's what's happening right now. Let's see another question here. Ashley from California is saying, doesn't the CCP already use all these tactics on their own people? Yeah, they do. But as we've been talking about, the CCP has already lost a lot of civil support. Remember what was happening before COVID. Before COVID was happening, you had these protests spreading. Before COVID, you had, again, the Hong Kong umbrella revolution. You had people going out and protesting against the Communist Party of China. The CCP was worried those protests were going to affect people inside mainland China and that there'd be a popular revolt to overthrow the CCP. In fact, there were already taking place on a pretty large scale, like social movements doing that. There were already happening like large-scale protests in China. And so the CCP, in order to stop those protests, they launched this iron-fisted movement to go and crush the agreement that the world had with Hong Kong and the Chinese Communist Party, which was, again, one party, two systems. The CCP was not supposed to be able to exert full control over Hong Kong. Hong Kong was supposed to have a British legal system and a elected democratic type government. They ended that. And they ended that because they were afraid of these protests spreading into the mainland. In mainland China, the CCP, under the guise of COVID, also launched all these different programs where if people went out to protest, they used the health code on people's phones to imprison them. And so, for example, you can read public reporting on this. There were people who were going and, protesting because, for example, protesting the banks. They were trying to get their money out of the banks. The banks were not giving them their money. Remember, in China, the biggest banks are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, like the People's Bank of China, for example. They were going and trying to get their money out. The CCP arrested them by turning their COVID health codes red. Meaning, when your COVID health code turns red on your phone, you have to go and report for mandatory quarantine. And so the CCP quarantined them for COVID because they were protesting against the banking system in China. And so the CCP was doing this as a way, using COVID as a way to crush civil uprising, right, as part of all of this. Now, I've mentioned in China, there are a couple areas of power, right? There are people who have basically lost, the majority of the country, even within the Chinese Communist Party itself, a lot of them no longer believe in communism. The support for the Communist Party is very low. The people who still support it, mostly, it's out of financial interest. It's because it's older people and they want their pensions, or younger people because they believed that they'd be able to have success later in life because of the Communist Party. It was on that. That is now dying. For the younger people, they have what's called the laying flat movement, where they don't want what they call the 996 work schedule, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. They don't want to work themselves to death. They don't want to have this kind of lifelong struggle where they're working nonstop and basically having dead-end lives. And so they're doing what's called lying flat, where they're not going to school, they're not taking care of anything, they're not getting jobs, and they're basically, quiet quitting the Communist Party. They're giving up. And the CCP is not going to have a future because of that if they don't do something about it. And they can't do anything about it because it's a quiet revolution. It's people just not pushing themselves, right? What you would call quiet quitting in a work environment. The other side is the older people. But because of the financial problems in China, right, the real estate industry is going belly up, the manufacturing is leaving China, a lot of the foreign investment is not coming in like it used to, and also because of the banking crisis, it's affecting just normal business. A lot of people who maybe supported the CCP just because of financial interests, they're also breaking with that. And so this is also why the CCP is so terrified of civil uprising right now. Why they're trying to crush all the foreign critics of the CCP, because they're terrified of civil uprising. And they're terrified that additional financial pressure, like from Trump or something like that, or even from Europe, Europe's even putting a lot of tariffs on China, that this could have the effect of tearing down the CCP. They are terrified for their survival, the survival of the party right now. And yeah, the CCP does do these information operations, but in China, it's losing a lot of power already, even regardless of it. Angel 76-1, he said, "This is not new. They have been doing this for decades. Do a search for the number of U.S. educational institutions that are owned by Chinese corporations. They recently acquired one of the largest curriculum companies in the U.S." And then you add another comment, "What I don't understand is how we allow them to come to our country and purchase our farmland, our businesses, our educational corporations. We couldn't go to China and buy land near their military bases." Yeah, the CCP does do this. They actually have a slogan for it. The Chinese Communist Party openly, they say that they want to manipulate the open system of the United States. And the argument is this. They say America is an open society, China is a closed society, and they believe that you can manipulate the legal systems, the business systems, the policy systems in the United States to weaponize it against ourselves. The slogan they have for this is "Strangle you with your own systems." This is what the CCP actually says. Strangle you with your own systems. So basically, oh, you believe in freedom of speech? Well, we will establish organizations in your country and we will use them to manipulate your news outlets, to maybe register, online influencers, to feed information to people of influence, and we will use freedom of speech to promote ourselves and undermine you. That's one example of it. Oh, you believe that businesses should be able to lobby your government. What does the CCP do? Well, the Chinese Communist Party lobbies our own government by using American businesses as the proxy. It goes to U.S. corporations, and it does this openly. In fact, this isn't even a secret. Chinese Communist Party or Chinese businesses will have American businesses lobby our government on behalf of the CCP. And so you have major corporations going into political offices and so on, and bringing their issues to the table. And these are big businesses that are big donors to our American political system, and they're saying, "Hey, we want to donate to you, but we need these issues. We need you to support this policy and that policy, or you're not going to get money." And it just so happens this policy and that policy are the CCP's policies. They do this openly. They don't even hide it. Again, and that's because we allow businesses to lobby on behalf of Chinese companies. They do a lot of stuff like this. Even the legal attacks. The CCP can establish, or even just have agents here who make friends and then have their friends file lawsuits in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, or compromise people. They invite them back to China. They make friends with them, and in China, they tell them, hey, file a lawsuit against this business or that business. They do that. Even in terms of, even on another level of this, they do it a lot with copyright. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party will use artificial intelligence to create copyright, to file copyright on music, on innovation, on technologies, on everything. And so they have this huge, huge store of intellectual property. And then if an American company innovates, or if somebody uses the technology, the Chinese company holding the intellectual property can then sue the American company saying, hey, you violated our copyright. That is also a form of legal warfare or lawfare. They've even done this against big corporations like Apple, claiming, for example, that Apple stole their technology, which is ridiculous because the CCP, they have entire military and civil operations to steal intellectual property from American companies and then replicate them in China. And then they'll take the stolen technology, make minor revisions to it, and then file copyrights on the revisions to the things they stole from the American companies, and then use that to sue the company they robbed in the first place. Which brings up the question, why do we allow this? Why do we let them do it, right? I do think this needs to be addressed in the future because it is ridiculous. It is, again, Angel 76 notes. They don't let us do that. They don't let us go to China and do that. So why do we let them do it here? And again, even the issue of just buying property and buying land and buying, American, for example, talent organizations of Hollywood and buying American food processors. Why do we let the CCP own that? Why do we let them do that? I think it does need to be addressed in the future. Anthony Evelyn, you're saying China recently showed 2 6th-generation combat aircraft recently. Why did they do that at this time? Right? I saw that. So the Chinese Communist Party recently unveiled what they claim is a 6th-generation fighter jet. And there's been a lot of arguments with this. You might remember the CCP previously unveiled its 5th-generation fighter jet, the J-20, and the J-20, I think they have the 21 also. I've actually done some analysis on this in the past. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors involved with this. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors. I'll give you an example. So first of all, the United States has noted that the J-20, the 5th-generation fighter jet of the Chinese Communist, I'm not talking 6th generation yet, this is the 5th-generation one, that it has elements on it that look like they were stolen from the F-35 designs. Because, again, the United States has 2 5th-generation fighter jets, the F-22 and the F-35, right? Those are our 5th-generation fighter jets. There's evidence the CCP stole the designs for our fighter jets and incorporated some of that into its designs for the J-20, their 5th-generation fighter jet. Myself and other analysts had noted at the time that even the J-20 was not actually a 5th-generation fighter jet. They're lying about it. The model of the 5th-generation fighter jet the CCP claims it has, it's actually based on a 4.5 generation jet that they got from the Soviet Union. 4.5 generation meaning it's a revised 4th generation jet that has some stealth elements to it, right? And so it doesn't have the type of technologies that would qualify as a 5th-generation jet. Still relatively advanced, don't get me wrong. But it looked like it was basically just a copy of a Soviet era, one of the last jets the Soviet Union designed actually, of a last generation Soviet jet, meaning it wasn't actually a 5th-generation fighter jet. Even some of the design elements would disqualify it as being stealth. Because if you ever look at the stealth bomber, for example, in the real sleek design, stealth technology, you need to have certain materials in terms of how you make it, right? You build the body. You need to have a type of design that doesn't have any ridges to it that would create something that would trigger a sound that would make it detectable. And again, it would have to have technologies to evade all the different sensors that a country would have. The CCP's J-20 does not have that. It would be discoverable on radar because again, it does not qualify as a 5th generation jet. And so there's a lot of dishonesty, maybe intellectual dishonesty or maybe intentional dishonesty. Because again, when you talk about military stuff, there is a lot of smoke and mirrors in terms of people saying, yeah, that's a 5th generation fighter jet. It was not. It would not qualify as that based on just basic aerodynamics and basic aircraft design. And not to mention the thing they mainly took it from, which was a 4.5 generation jet of the Soviet Union. It would not qualify. And so for the CCP, that was more about propaganda, right? They wanted to say, look what we can do. Look at how advanced we are. And, you know, they want to look advanced. The Chinese Communist Party can't even build its own jet engines, let alone innovate so far that they could build a 5th generation jet. They still buy their engines. They still get their engines from from Russia, not the Soviet Union. They still buy their engines from Russia because they can't manufacture them. They still get their engines from somewhere else because they can't build them. And Russia is not exactly up to par either in terms of their military equipment. They don't have it. And so them revealing a 6th generation jet, I can tell you, just based purely on my analysis, some of the design elements of that 6th generation jet do not have the sleek design that would be necessary for proper stealth. I don't believe it's actually a 6th generation jet. I don't even believe it would qualify as a 5th generation jet, based on purely my own analysis. But I believe that a lot of people, here's the thing when it comes to military talk, a lot of them would say, well, you know what, they claim they have it, we need to innovate to answer that threat, regardless of whether it's real or fake. And so for a lot of military guys are saying, well, we don't know if it's real. We don't know if it's as advanced as they claim it is. All it means is that we need to innovate for the threat. And so America now needs to build a military reaction system to combat the alleged 6th generation jet. And even if it's not capable of that, even if it's not real, we need to treat it as if it is real because we need to deal with the possible threat. That's how this stuff usually goes. Let's see here. Kellogg's note viable. So not available, I'm sorry. You're saying, how would you rank Russian communists against Chinese communists? Are one worse than the other? Why? The Russian communists were a lot, it was different eras. Let me put it this way. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Chinese Communist Party took lessons on what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the basic lesson was this. You know, the Soviet Union, remember, during the Cold War, what were they doing? They were the leaders of the global communist revolution. That was actually why in the United States during the Cold War, if you were a government official, you could not legally be a member of the Communist Party. And that was a big controversy in the United States, right? That was a big controversy in the United States because people would say, you know, you get called to testify in front of the Committee on Un-American Activities, and they'd ask you, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And people said, why are you harassing them, and so on. The reason was, during that time, if you were a member of the Communist Party, it meant that you had sworn allegiance to the Soviet Union. If you were a card-carrying Communist Party member, you were sworn in allegiance to the Soviet Union of Russia, meaning you were representing a foreign government. And so for U.S. representatives or elected officials or military officers, if you were a Communist Party member, it meant that you had dual allegiances with an enemy of the United States, right? Now, The problem we have right now with the Chinese Communist Party is we still have that problem. There are a lot of elected leaders, there are business leaders, there are journalists, there are investors, there are businesses, there are academics, and so on, the list goes on, who have allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. They believe in the communist revolution, they support the CCP, they act in the interests of the CCP. The difference is they don't have like a registration program where you can call them a card-carrying communist. They don't have that anymore, right? These individuals, business leaders, journalists, academics, government officials, they can actually act as agents of the CCP without being officially agents of the CCP. Because again, the system is different. The CCP learned from it. You don't need to have it on paper. You don't need to say you're a card-carrying communist, right? That's the difference. The allegiance is the same, but the documentation is not there. That's a big difference. The other side is the Russians acted with a lot more hubris. They had a lot more pride. And so they were a lot more aggressive. They were a lot more ham-fisted. And they had a lot less finesse when they went and did their operations. The CCP is a lot more deceptive, right? And they unfortunately pull from the most deceptive elements of like Chinese warfare. Things like, for example, hide your strength, bide your time. Like, for example, under Deng Xiaoping. You pretend, when you're weak, appear strong. When you're strong, appear weak, which goes back to Sun Tzu in The Art of War. They've incorporated these things. And so when they go and try to compromise American businesses or foreign leaders or whatever else, they don't do it like the Soviet Union did. And because they've basically merged their economic system with the U.S., there are ways even of concealing payments. Cryptocurrency gives them one way to do it, new technologies. But also, let me put it this way. If you are an agent of the Chinese Communist Party and you're getting paid by them, do you know what it looks like? It does not look like, a Chinese spy comes and sneaks here and hands you a briefcase under a table. Do you know what it looks like? It looks like you have an advisory position on a major Chinese company. That's what it looks like. It means that a big Chinese company takes you on as an advisor, and again with China, a lot of these companies are state-run enterprises, and they just pay you. They pay you a normal legal salary. And maybe you have a phone call with them every now and then. They say, hey, comrade, what do you recommend we do on this business deal? And you say, well, I, as your advisor in America, recommend you do this. And they might not do it, and they might do it. What's important is they disguise the payments as being legitimate business payments, and that's how they pay them. It's simple, right? Or you're a major business, and in exchange for you serving the interests of the CCP, they just give you access to the China market, and they have their media in China promote you, and they maybe ramp up ticket sales for your movie or something like that. Hollywood, that's a big thing. It's why they do that with China, the Chinese Communist Party. If you want to get your movie shown in China, you oftentimes have to co-produce the film with the CCP or with these Chinese organizations, and you have to serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. During the time of the Cold War in the Soviet Union, if you did that with the Soviets, they'd call you, they'd probably get you for being a foreign agent. They'd say you're working with the Soviet Union and you're cooperating with them and they're paying you. We don't say that with businesses these days because business operations of American companies in China is accepted. I'd say it's the same thing with a lot of news outlets. A lot of news outlets are only able to function in China if you don't report certain information. If a journalist reports on the human rights abuses in China, especially they talk about the persecution of Falun Gong, they kick you out. They might even imprison you. Your entire media might get kicked out of China. And so all these big news organizations that have operations in China, they cannot report actual news on China, which is the ridiculous argument because well, how do you cover China if you can't go to China? I'd say, how can you cover China if you're in China? Because they'll kick you out if you're honest, right? It's ridiculous. Yeah, again, during the Cold War, you could be labeled a foreign agent for doing this stuff. These days, because of the open system, it's allowed to take place and you're not called a foreign agent for doing it. But I would argue it's the same thing. I would argue many of these organizations are acting as agents of the Chinese Communist Party with these ties. It's just, again, because of the business relations and the way business works and the way we've opened up with them, it's not treated like that legally, at least not in a lot of regards. There are some exceptions to that. Let's see here. Judy Akeem, you're saying, my thought is we have built an entire infrastructure on manipulation. Wherever you look, you're emotionally programmed and manipulated. People are not grounded in their families and values. Yeah, I'd agree with that. You know, the unfortunate reality today is that manipulation is coming from many angles. You know, even advertising is manipulation. In fact, it goes back to, if you read the book Propaganda, I can't remember the author right now. The author of the book Propaganda, written in the early 1900s, laid out the strategies of modern advertising. I believe it was Edward Bernays, if I remember properly. The issue with that book and Bernays is that his strategies for advertising were also adopted into political propaganda. And Bernays actually said something very interesting at the beginning of his book, where he says, and again, this is the guy who formed the basis of modern advertising and modern political propaganda in the West. He said that the true secret powers of the world are the ones that control the information landscape, because they're the ones who control the minds and the hearts of the world. And, you know, I talked before about even the Chinese Communist Party's systems of subversion. If you talk about what's called the United Front, which is the way that they have their spy networks, you know, you've heard about the secret Chinese police stations and so on. And I talked before about how they compromise businesses and academics and government officials and everything like that. The way it works is this. The actual saying they have for their operations is they aim to, quote, capture the civil society. Meaning, you can have what looks like a free country. You can have what looks like an independent business. You can have what looks like a normal functioning society with its own government, but it is being controlled by another government. The CCP tries to co-opt the influencers in that society. And so if your politicians are serving a foreign government, if your academics and the people educating your kids are serving a foreign government, if your news organizations are serving a foreign government, if your businesses are serving a foreign government, and so on, your movies, your entertainment industry, your online influencers, they're all serving the interests of a foreign government and attacking your government. It means that although you have the illusion of being your own country, you are actually just a puppet state of another country, because they are puppeteering the people who control the money, the hearts and minds of your people, what is being done politically, and even the business decisions of your country. Your country is co-opted to act in the interests of a foreign country while attacking your country. And frankly, I would point to many of these organizations that are extremely critical of the United States. They criticize our leaders, they criticize our culture, they criticize our history. Think of all the online influencers and journalists and politicians who seem to hate America. But they're they're in favor of, you know, foreign communist regimes. Well, whose interest are they in, and what is triggering them to behave in such a way? Even to the point where they educate our kids like this in school. The CCP's United Front intentionally does that. They aim to do that. And, you know, unfortunately, I think, you know, America needs to do more about this. I think we're asleep at the wheel. For the CCP, this is war. We are in the midst of a war, and we're not treating it like such. And we relatively let these things just happen. And unfortunately, it goes to people, people like myself, frankly, who are exposing it, and a handful of other people who are trying to expose it. And we get attacked for it because, at least in the eyes of these foreign regimes, people like me, we're regarded like troops on a battlefield, right? They want to destroy us, which is why I've personally been threatened by the CCP. I've been directly threatened with death threats by them in the past. It's because they regard people like myself as being troops on a battlefield, because the government is not fighting this war. It's done manipulating the open systems of the United States. I should say they have gone after some Chinese spies recently. I think there needs to be a lot more done on it, and I hope they do a lot more on it. On Judith's point, though, you also say that people are not grounded in their families and values. Actually, and I'd say that that's the greatest weapon against these things. You need to have a foundation. You know I'm religious, and I don't try to preach to you any one religion. I think people should have their own values. I think people should have their own cultures. And I do believe that grounding yourself in your family is the best way to face this. Because I think when you have a circle of support and you do have kind of an immovable moral system, whether it's rooted in your religious belief or your personal values as an individual, that system of values is what makes you immune to this type of influence. That system of values is what guards you against these types of operations. And I would say the people who tend to get co-opted are the ones who don't have that. They're the ones who have very flimsy systems of values, and they get taken by the current, so to speak. They get swept downstream because they have nothing rooting them. And on that point too, I'd actually say that's why communist regimes, whenever they come into power, what do they do typically? Well, they start a famine, then they persecute, whatever targeted group they came into power saying they were going to destroy. Then what do? They destroy the religious people. Why do they destroy the religious people? It's because the religious people have a system of values that is rooted and unchangeable. And when they witness an evil regime doing evil things, the religious people will criticize it, or they will recognize it as evil. And so the first thing communists have to do is destroy those people. That's why the CCP persecutes Christians. That's why they persecute Falun Dafa practitioners. That's why they persecute, Muslim Uyghurs. That's why they persecute Tibetan Buddhists and everybody else. It's anybody who would question the legitimacy or the morals of the Chinese Communist Party, and they want to destroy them. That's why they do it. That's why the Soviet Union did it. That's why every communist regime does that. It's because they view people with rooted good morals as enemies of the state. And again, something to keep your eye out for, because there are communists, among us here, maybe not among us, but here in the United States, who also want to attack religion. And frankly, look at what they do. You do see them doing this, attacking the moral foundations of our society. All right, folks, that said, heavy news today. Join me tomorrow, again, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. There's a lot to talk about these days. And again, folks, thank you so much for being here. Please share this episode. Help us get the word out. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.